Welcome back. I'm Tara Radosevich of HUD's Office of Public and Indian Housing. In this segment, we'll walk through steps of EBLL response for other covered units in a multi-unit property. When an environmental investigation identifies lead-based paint hazards in the index unit of a building or property with multiple PBV units, the owner has additional testing and control responsibilities for those other PBV units. The required actions for other covered units in the property must be taken at the same time as the actions for the index unit. The timeline for the EBLL response steps for other covered units begins the day the owner or PHA receives the environmental investigation results indicating lead-based paint hazards in the index unit. Upon receiving those results, the owner must perform a risk assessment on all or a sample of other covered units, that is, PBV-assisted units and common areas in the property where a child under age 6 lives or is expected to live, and any associated common areas. These risk assessments must be performed by a certified lead-based paint risk assessor, but the timeline for conducting the assessments and the number of assessments to be conducted depends on the size of the property. For properties with up to 20 other covered units, risk assessments must be conducted within 30 calendar days of receiving the environmental investigation results. For properties with more than 20 other covered units, risk assessments must be conducted within 60 calendar days of receiving the environmental investigation results. Note that for other covered units, the owner is required to do a risk assessment, not an environmental investigation as is required for the index unit. A risk assessment is an on-site investigation to determine the existence, nature, severity, and location of lead-based paint hazards. It also includes a report explaining the results and options for reducing lead-based paint hazards. It can be performed only by risk assessors, certified or licensed by the EPA or an EPA-authorized entity. Depending on the size of the property, the Lead-Safe Housing Rule allows owners to perform risk assessments on a random sample of other covered units in the property, rather than all of them. Sampling is allowed because in most instances a pattern can be determined after inspecting a fraction of the units. The number of units required for the sample depends on the age of the property and the number of units in the housing development. While a PHA or owner may, for their own strategic reasons, choose to conduct risk assessments on all the other covered units in the property, random sampling is allowed for pre-1960 properties with more than 20 covered dwelling units, and for properties built between 1960 and 1977 with more than 10 covered dwelling units. Table 7.3 in HUD's Guidelines for the Evaluation and Control of Lead-Based Paint Hazards in Housing provides guidance on all the sample sizes required and how to select an unbiased sample, but your certified lead-based paint risk assessor will likely design and implement the sampling protocol. After the risk assessments on the other covered units are complete, the owner must address any findings from these assessments. Since many of the requirements for occupant protections, control work, clearance, and ongoing maintenance are the same for other covered units as for index units, much of the information has already been covered in the previous video segment. However, we will briefly review the steps involved and highlight any ways in which the steps for other covered units differ from the steps for index units. The first step is to consider whether the risk assessment identified lead-based paint hazards in any of the covered units tested. If the risk assessments conclude that there are no lead-based paint hazards in any of the other covered units, the owner needs to notify residents and HUD of the results of the risk assessment, and then the EBLL response is complete. However, if the risk assessments find lead-based paint hazards in one or more covered units, the owner must respond to those hazards. Responding to lead-based paint hazards in a covered unit is very similar to responding to lead-based paint hazards in an index unit. The same 6 steps: notify, protect, control, notify, maintain, and reevaluate apply equally to index and covered units. The video segment on EBLL response in the index unit covers these 6 steps in detail. Finally, keep in mind that the reevaluation requirements for PBV units are determined by the value of the PBV itself, just as with the reevaluation requirements for the index units. There are 2 ways that your EBLL response steps might differ from the steps you take for index units. First, if the risk assessment was done on a sample of units, and the assessment revealed lead-based paint hazards in one or more units in the sample, then all the units and common areas in the sampling universe, that is, the set of units from which the sample was selected, are presumed to have lead-based paint hazards. In other words, if the risk assessment found lead-based paint hazards via sampling of covered units, then the owner must proceed under the assumption that all covered units of that similar construction also have lead-based paint hazards. This is a concept that the certified risk assessor will be familiar with and will be included in the report they provide. Second, unlike with the environmental investigation, the owner can notify residents of the risk assessment results by central posting in an accessible common area, since there should be no PII in the risk assessment. But whether by central posting, letter, or notice to each dwelling, these notifications must be completed within 15 calendar days of receiving the risk assessment results. At this point, our discussion of EBLL response and other covered units is complete. We are going to conclude by spending a few minutes on steps that you can take right away to ensure full compliance with the amended lead-safe housing rule. The first step is to ensure that all lead-based paint testing required under the existing lead-safe housing rule is already completed and that records are securely stored at the property and available for inspection. If lead-based paint remained after the abatement, it should be monitored as part of ongoing building operations to ensure that abatement methods have not failed. Second, if the PHA will assist owners on evaluations, then the PHA should determine whether any lead evaluations and hazard control work will be performed by trained, certified staff or through contract. If new contracts require approval by the PHA's Board of Commissioners, the process should be started in advance of the need. You should also make sure to identify a current contact person at the local or state health department for communication purposes. You may also want to inform residents of the risks of lead-based paint and encourage them to have young children tested for the lead in their blood. For this purpose, HUD has produced a fact sheet entitled, Update for Families in Federally Assisted Housing. It also makes sense to start talking to your PBV owners about their obligations under the lead-safe housing rule, or to provide them with a refresher. HUD has prepared a fact sheet for owners of PBV units to help with this process. Before we close this series on the PBV program, we'll leave you with a list of key resources to help you comply with the requirements of the lead-safe housing rule and the lead-safe housing rule amendment. All the resources are available on the HUD Exchange. If you would like further information concerning EBLL response action steps in PBV units, please review the fact sheets for PHA staff, owners and families, the lead-safe housing rule itself, HUD's guidelines for the evaluation and control of lead-based paint hazards in housing, and Notice PIH 2017-13. All the resources shown on your screen and will be linked in the accompanying notes. Please watch our video segments on the PBV program and public housing if you're involved in the administration of these programs. Finally, email any questions and comments you have on this video, as well as requests for additional resources on the lead-safe housing rule to leadregulations@hud.gov. We've now concluded the EBLL response steps for other covered units in a property receiving project-based voucher assistance. We thank you for taking the time to join us in exploring PHA and owner responsibilities in responding to an EBL report in a PBV unit. Please remember to keep both the index unit and other covered unit requirements in mind as you review your responsibilities and prepare to respond quickly and effectively to EBLL reports in your jurisdiction. Thank you.